It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and the wedding venue looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. The hall was grand, with high ceilings draped in white and gold and flowers everywhere. Bright, colorful arrangements that added life to the space. Soft music played in the background, setting a calm and romantic mood. Guests filled the seats, chatting excitedly and taking pictures. Everyone seemed eager for the ceremony to begin. It was the kind of day people remember forever. For the bride, the day had arrived after months of planning. Every little detail had been carefully thought out, from the cake to the flowers to the table settings. She had worked hard to make sure everything was perfect. Her friends and family surrounded her, laughing and sharing memories as she stood near the altar, looking like a vision of happiness in her wedding dress. The groom, standing at the altar, couldn't have been more different. He looked confident almost to the point of arrogance. He was a businessman, successful, well-dressed, and used to getting what he wanted. His friends, also dressed in suits, were standing by his side, chatting about everything from sports to the economy. He wasn't nervous at all. In fact, he was so sure of himself, it seemed as though this was just another day at the office. The day had to go perfectly. After all, this was a celebration of him and his bride, of their love and their future together. But then something happened that no one could have predicted, something that would change the tone of the entire day and put a shadow over the rest of the celebration as the guests started to move toward the reception area after the ceremony. The groom's attention was caught by a man walking through the crowd. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an air of quiet confidence about him. The man was moving between groups of guests, speaking with people, shaking hands, and generally blending in as if he had been invited. But there was something that made the groom uneasy. The man seemed to be hanging around the area where the wedding gifts had been placed. He wasn't carrying anything or acting suspicious, but for some reason, the groom felt a strong sense of discomfort. It didn't make sense. Why was he standing so close to the gifts? It was an odd thing to notice, especially in the midst of a wedding celebration, but the groom couldn't shake the feeling. The groom decided to walk over and check things out. He wasn't exactly sure why, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. As he approached the man, he tried to make himself look casual, as if it was just a regular conversation. "Hey," the groom said, his voice polite but firm. "Can I help you with something? You seem a little too interested in the gifts over there." The man looked up, a bit startled at first. He had been standing there admiring the gifts, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had come to the wedding as a guest, but the groom's question caught him off guard. "Oh, I'm just admiring the gifts," the man replied, trying to sound casual. "They're beautiful. I'm not here to cause any trouble." But the groom's mind was already working overtime, thinking the worst. There was no way this guy was just admiring the gifts. He didn't recognize him, and that in itself seemed suspicious. What kind of person would show up at a wedding and then stand around the gifts without even being invited? The groom's suspicions grew stronger, and before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "You're trying to steal something, aren't you? I saw you eyeing the gifts. What, did you think no one would notice?" The words came out harshly, more aggressive than he intended. The man's face fell, clearly taken aback by the sudden accusation. A few guests who were nearby stopped talking and turned their attention to the scene. The groom didn't care. In his mind, he had already made up his mind about this man. He was there for a reason, and it wasn't a good one. "I'm not trying to steal anything," the man said, his voice calm but firm. He was obviously surprised by the accusation. "I don't even know why you'd think that. I'm just a guest here, same as everyone else." But the groom wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own feelings of being wronged, too quick to assume the worst. "No one invited you," he said sharply, his voice rising with frustration. "You don't even belong here. You're probably here to take something and leave. I don't care what you say, I know what you're up to." The guests were watching now, and it felt like the room had gone silent. People were exchanging uncomfortable glances. Some looked confused, unsure of what was happening. Others looked awkward, not sure how to react. The bride, who had been talking to her family, heard the argument and turned around. She instantly recognized the man standing with the groom, the man who was now being accused of theft. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew the man. In fact, he was one of the most important people in her life. He wasn't some stranger or random guest. He was the CEO of the company she had been working with for years. He had been not just a mentor to her, but a key figure in her success. She felt a rush of panic as she realized what was happening. She quickly walked over, trying to defuse the situation before it could get worse. "David," she said, addressing her fiancé, "please stop." The groom, who was still fuming, turned to face her. He didn't understand why she was intervening. She looked upset, but he didn't know what for. All he could think was that this man was a thief and he needed to be called out. "Emily, this guy is stealing something. He doesn't belong here. He's been eyeing the gifts like he's here to take something." His words came out fast, almost breathless, like he was convinced he had to protect everyone from a danger that only he could see. Emily's eyes widened as she finally processed what he had said. Her body tensed and her heart raced as she glanced at the man standing in front of her. She knew him well. In fact, she had worked closely with him for years. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. The man the groom was accusing of theft wasn't just some random guest. He was an important part of her professional life, someone she trusted deeply. Taking a deep breath, Emily took a step forward and addressed the man. "David, please listen," she said. He's someone I know very well. He's not a thief. Her voice faltered for a moment as she searched for the right words. But the groom wasn't listening. His mind was still clouded by suspicion, and he wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. As far as he was concerned, he had already made up his mind. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone could feel it. Emily stood there, torn between the man she loved and the man she had come to respect and admire. What had started as a day filled with love and celebration now felt like it was on the verge of falling apart. The room felt tense. The guests, once cheerful and full of excitement, had now fallen into an uncomfortable silence. The soft hum of conversations had stopped, replaced by nervous whispers as people turned their attention toward the unfolding drama. The bride was standing there looking bewildered, and the groom was still standing firm, convinced that his accusations were right. The man who had been the center of the dispute stood silently, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. The groom, his face red with frustration, couldn't understand why his fiancée was so calm. Why wasn't she siding with him? This man, this stranger, was obviously up to no good, and yet she wasn't reacting the way he thought she should. She seemed almost protective of him, as if she were trying to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But David couldn't grasp what was really going on. "Emily," David said, his voice rising as he turned toward her, his words quick and sharp. "What is going on? Are you seriously telling me that you don't see this?" His eyes shifted between the man standing in front of him and his fiancée, still unable to make sense of what was happening. Emily looked at David, her expression one of both sadness and frustration. She didn't know how to explain it all in a way that David would understand. She had worked hard to make her relationship with David a happy one. They had talked about their futures, shared their dreams, and built a life together. But now here she was, facing the harsh reality that the man she had chosen to spend her life with was showing a side of himself that she had never seen before. A side of him that felt cold, judgmental, and dismissive of the people she cared about. "David, I'm telling you, he's not here to steal anything," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. She stepped a little closer to the groom, her hands clasped in front of her as she tried to collect her thoughts. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also didn't want her fiancé's actions to go unchecked. "I've known him for years. He's not some random person who just showed up to steal gifts from our wedding." David glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "Then who is he, Emily? Why was he standing there looking at the gifts like he was about to walk off with something? Don't you think that's odd?" His words were laced with frustration, but he was still struggling to connect the dots. His mind couldn't process the idea that this man wasn't a threat. After all, why would someone like him, dressed so well and moving through the crowd like he belonged there, be at the wedding without an invitation? Emily's heart began to race as she realized the depth of David's misunderstanding. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding about a guest at their wedding. It was something bigger. It was about how David saw the world, how he saw people. She had never realized how quickly he could jump to conclusions about someone based purely on how they looked or where they came from. This wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. Trying to remain calm, Emily turned to the man who had been accused. "I'm so sorry for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "David doesn't understand, but I do. I know you're not here to cause trouble. The man nodded, still looking surprised but not angry. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He had learned over the years that staying calm in these kinds of situations was always the best approach. He glanced at Emily, his eyes softening as if to say, "It's okay. I'm not upset with you." But David seemed determined to see him as the villain in this story. Emily could feel her patience wearing thin. It was one thing for her fiancé to question someone's intentions privately, but to make such a public accusation in front of all the guests was something she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady as she spoke again. "David, I'm telling you the truth. He's the CEO of my company. I've worked with him for years. He's been instrumental in the success of everything I've done. And he's here today because he's my friend," Emily said, her eyes locked onto David's, trying to make him see the reality of the situation. "He's here as my guest, not to take anything." "You've got it all wrong." For a moment there was silence. David stood frozen, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't process the information Emily had just given him. He stared at her, his mind racing. The CEO of her company? He had no idea. He hadn't even heard her mention him before. The idea that this man was not only invited but also an important part of Emily's life was completely foreign to him. I didn't know," David stammered, his voice faltering for the first time since the argument started. He took a step back, clearly unsettled. "I didn't know he was important to you like that." Emily's chest tightened and she had to hold herself together. She had never imagined that something like this would happen. She had never thought that her fiancé, someone she had trusted, would treat another human being like this, especially not someone who had helped her so much in her career. The thought of David judging him based purely on his appearance, without taking the time to understand the person he was accusing, hurt her deeply. "I'm sorry, but you can't just assume things like that about people," Emily said, her voice a little louder now, though she was still trying to remain calm. "You don't know anything about him. You don't know what he's done or who he is, but you've already decided he's a thief. That's not okay, David. It's not." David shifted uncomfortably, now realizing how bad the situation had become. He looked around, seeing that some of the guests were watching him, others whispering amongst themselves. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, and it made him squirm. He had expected to be the center of attention, yes, but not like this. Not for something like this. The man who had been so calm through it all now took a small step toward Emily. He could see that she was clearly upset, and he didn't want to make things worse. He knew that public confrontations were never easy, and this had spiraled quickly. But he also didn't want her to feel like she had to take sides or explain things that didn't need explaining. "It's okay," he said to Emily, giving her a reassuring smile. "I understand. I know how these things can be." He turned his gaze to David, his tone warm but firm. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I never was." David stood there, his mouth slightly open, trying to piece together the mess he had made. His face was flushed with embarrassment now, and he could feel his own pride starting to crack. He had jumped to conclusions, and in doing so, he had humiliated both himself and the man standing in front of him. He could feel his stomach twist with regret. I'm sorry," David said, his voice quieter now, the anger draining from his tone. "I didn't know who you were, and I made an assumption." "I'm sorry," the man nodded, his expression softening. "It's all right. I understand," he said gently, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. He turned to Emily, offering her a small but understanding smile. "I'm just glad we can move past this." Emily took a deep breath, her own emotions still swirling. She had never felt this disappointed in David before. He had always been confident, maybe a little too sure of himself at times, but this was something else. This was something she wasn't sure she could forgive. Not immediately, anyway. Not until she saw whether David would truly learn from this mistake, or if it would just be swept under the rug. As the conversation came to a close, Emily stood there, still processing what had just happened. She wasn't sure where things would go from here, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back to the way things were. This moment, this mistake, had exposed something deeper, a crack she wasn't sure could be fixed so easily. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had started as a joyous day full of celebration was now thick with tension. The guests, still processing what had just happened, tried to go back to their conversations, but the air felt different. People couldn't help but glance over at the bride and groom. Some were unsure of what to say. Others felt awkward about the way the whole situation had unfolded. For Emily, the damage had already been done. The feelings of betrayal, confusion, and hurt were settling in, and there was no way to take them back. She looked at her fiancé, who stood there, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had apologized, but the words didn't seem to carry the weight she needed them to. She didn't want to make a scene on her wedding day, but the truth was, she felt like something inside her had changed. She had always known David to be strong-willed, a bit stubborn and confident, but she had never seen him so blind to the humanity of someone else. His assumptions, his rush to judgment had hurt more than she could put into words. David, on the other hand, felt his pride shrink with every passing second. He had spent most of his life being in control, always confident in his decisions. He was used to people respecting him, looking up to him. He prided himself on being the one people came to for answers, the one who could always fix problems. But now, standing here, he realized he had made a huge mistake. He had accused someone who was important to Emily, of stealing, and not just in private but in front of everyone. The public nature of it only made it worse. He had assumed the worst about someone he knew nothing about, someone who was integral to the woman he was about to marry. It felt like a slap in the face. David had tried to apologize, but the words didn't feel right. He had spoken quickly, almost as if to dismiss the situation. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how wrong he had been. He had let his assumptions dictate his actions, and in doing so, he had hurt the woman he loved and embarrassed himself in front of everyone. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, and he hated it. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this small. He had never been in a situation where he was so clearly in the wrong. The man who had been accused, meanwhile, stood to the side, quietly watching the interaction unfold. He was an accomplished professional, someone who had built a successful career from the ground up. He had learned over the years how to handle uncomfortable situations with grace, but even he could feel the sting of the accusation. He wasn't angry. He didn't think that would solve anything, but he couldn't help but feel disrespected. It wasn't about the accusation itself. It was about how quickly David had decided to judge him. He understood that misunderstandings happen, but this felt different. It felt personal. He had been a guest at many events over the years, and never had he felt so out of place. Never had he been singled out, accused, and scrutinized in front of so many people, and for no reason other than a simple assumption based on his appearance. He looked over at Emily, who seemed torn. She was standing there, clearly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between David and the crowd. It was clear she was caught in the middle. He could see that she wasn't angry with him, but her silence spoke volumes. This wasn't just about the misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something that would require more than an apology to fix. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, Emily spoke. Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind her words was undeniable. She looked at David, her gaze firm and unwavering. "David, I need you to understand something," she said, taking a deep breath as she gathered her thoughts. What happened here wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It wasn't just about some misplaced accusation. It's about how you see people. It's about the assumptions you make about others. You saw someone you didn't recognize, someone who didn't look like he fit in, and you immediately decided he was guilty. You didn't stop to think. You didn't stop to ask questions. You just assumed the worst. David opened his mouth to speak, but Emily held up a hand to stop him. She needed him to hear this. "I know you're embarrassed, and I know you're sorry," she continued, her voice softening slightly, but the intensity was still there. "But this goes beyond the mistake you made today. It's about something deeper. It's about how quickly we judge people based on their appearance or their background. And it's not okay, not here, not in my life." David was silent, his mind spinning. He had never thought of it like that. In his world, where everything was about appearances, success, and confidence, he had never stopped to question his own biases. He had never stopped to think about how his assumptions might hurt others. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw him standing there, and something about it didn't sit right with me. I didn't know him, I didn't recognize him, and I made a snap judgment. I should have trusted you more. I should have known better." Emily nodded, but the sadness in her eyes was hard to miss. It's not just about trust, David, it's about respect. And today I didn't feel respected. Not by you and not by the way you treated someone who's important to me. There was a long pause as both of them stood there, the weight of the situation settling over them. David could feel the sting of her words, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to say. The truth was he had failed her in a way he hadn't fully understood until now. He had always prided himself on being a problem solver, a fixer, but today he was faced with a problem he couldn't fix with a quick apology. The man, who had been silently watching the conversation unfold, finally stepped forward. He knew that the best way to move past this wasn't to dwell on the past mistakes. Instead, it was to offer a way forward. "It's okay," he said gently, turning to David. "I'm not upset. I understand how these things happen, but I think it's important that we all take a moment to reflect on how quickly we can let our assumptions shape our actions. I don't think anyone intended for this to go the way it did, but I do think it's a wake-up call for all of us." David nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He hadn't expected to hear that from the man he had wrongly accused. But the calmness in his voice, the understanding, made David feel even worse. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to jump to conclusions, and yet here was the man he had wronged, offering him forgiveness and wisdom. "Thank you," David said, his voice full of regret. "I'm sorry, truly." Emily watched the exchange, a small part of her feeling relieved. This wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. She wasn't sure how things would unfold between her and David from here. She still needed time to process everything. But one thing was clear: David had learned a hard lesson today. Whether it would stick was up to him. As the evening went on, the wedding festivities continued, though the mood had shifted. The laughter wasn't as loud, the conversations weren't as light. But there was a sense of quiet reflection in the air. People had seen something unfold that wasn't just about a wedding or a celebration. It was about human nature, about assumptions, and about the things we sometimes overlook. David sat at the table with Emily, but there was no longer the carefree air that had once defined their relationship. There was no longer the easy laughter or the promises of a bright future without hurdles. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between them, one that spoke of the work ahead. A work that David knew he would have to do, not just for their relationship, but for himself. If he truly wanted to be the man Emily deserved, he would need to look deeper into his own assumptions and biases. He wasn't sure how to start, but he knew this was the first real test of their future together. The evening ended without any more drama, but the memory of what happened lingered in the air. David wasn't sure where things would go from here, but one thing was clear. This day, this moment had changed him forever. The days following the wedding were filled with a strange sense of quiet. The joy of the celebration had faded, replaced by an uneasy tension that lingered between David and Emily. They were both trying to move past what had happened, but it wasn't easy. The weight of the argument, the public humiliation, and the words that were exchanged couldn't be forgotten so quickly. For Emily, it wasn't just about the mistake David had made. It was about the deeper issue that had been brought to the surface. The way he had rushed to judgment, how quickly he had let his assumptions take control, and how little he had trusted her to explain the situation. Emily had always known that David could be impulsive, sometimes even too confident for his own good, but this was different. This wasn't just about being stubborn or overly self-assured. It was about a lack of respect for her judgment, for the people she valued, and for the relationship they were building. The more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something inside her had shifted. She had never seen David act this way before, and it left her wondering whether this was a side of him that had always been there, just hidden beneath the surface. David, on the other hand, was struggling to understand what had gone wrong. He had apologized, but Emily still seemed distant. They hadn't talked much about the incident since the wedding. At first, he thought maybe it was just the shock of the moment. After all, Emily had seemed upset, but he figured she would eventually come around. But as the days went by, he realized that things weren't as simple as he had hoped. Emily wasn't just upset about what happened at the wedding. She was questioning everything that had led up to it. And to his frustration, he couldn't find a way to fix it. The silence between them felt heavier with every passing day. David knew he had messed up, but he wasn't sure how to make it right. Apologizing again felt pointless, and he didn't want to keep bringing it up if Emily wasn't ready to talk. He had always been someone who could fix things, someone who could solve problems with a plan and a little bit of effort. But this wasn't something he could fix with a quick gesture or a heartfelt apology. This was about trust, and trust, he realized, wasn't something you could simply rebuild overnight. It was one evening, a week after the wedding, when Emily finally decided they needed to talk. She had spent days thinking about the situation, about her relationship with David, and about the choices she had to make moving forward. The conversation had to happen, whether it was comfortable or not. She couldn't let things fester any longer. She had always prided herself on being straightforward, but this felt different. She wasn't just confronting David about one mistake. She was confronting the entire dynamic of their relationship. She wasn't sure what the future would look like, but she knew that if they were going to move forward, they needed to start by understanding each other. "David, we need to talk," Emily said, her voice calm but firm as she sat down next to him on the couch. He had been staring out the window, lost in thought, but at her words he turned to face her. There was a moment of silence as both of them took in the weight of the situation. Neither of them had said much since the wedding, and the quiet between them had become almost unbearable. David shifted uncomfortably, sensing the seriousness in Emily's tone. "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about it too. I know I messed up and I don't know how to make it right." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "It's not just about what happened at the wedding, David. It's about how quickly you jumped to conclusions, how you treated someone I care about without even knowing who he was. I understand that you were upset, but what hurt more than anything was the way you didn't even trust me to explain the situation. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for respect, for trust." David's stomach twisted at her words. He hadn't realized how much he had hurt her by not taking a step back, by not trusting her to handle the situation in her own way. He had been so consumed by his own frustration, by his own need to control the narrative, that he hadn't stopped to consider her perspective. "I was wrong," he said, his voice sincere. "I get it now. I acted out of fear, and I let that fear control me. But I need you to understand I never meant to hurt you. I was scared. I saw someone I didn't recognize and I panicked. But that's no excuse for how I treated you, or him." Emily nodded, her fingers playing with the edge of the couch cushion as she took in his words. "I know you weren't trying to hurt me, but that doesn't change the fact that you did. And it's not just about that moment, it's about the bigger picture. It's about how you see the world, David. It's about how you see people. You can't just judge someone based on how they look or what they wear. You have to see them for who they really are, not just the assumptions you make about them." David swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in deeper. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who could fix anything. But this wasn't something that could be fixed with a quick solution or a gesture of goodwill. This was about changing how he saw the world, and more importantly, how he saw the people in it. He had to start by understanding Emily's point of view, and that meant confronting his own biases. "I've been so caught up in my own world," he said slowly, his voice filled with regret. "I've never had to think about things like that before. I've always been surrounded by people who think like I do, who see the world the way I see it. But you're right. I've been blind, and I'm sorry. I really am." Emily looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "I know you're trying, and I appreciate that. But this is going to take time. It's going to take more than just saying sorry and moving on. It's about being aware of how we treat others, about being more mindful of the way we act and the way we think. It's about making the choice to be better." David nodded, the realization settling over him. He didn't want to lose Emily. He didn't want this mistake to define their relationship. But he knew that if they were going to move forward, they both had work to do. He had to prove to her that he was capable of growth, that he was willing to change for the better. And he had to be patient with himself as he learned how to see the world through a different lens. "I don't know if I can change overnight," David said, his voice filled with vulnerability, "but I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I can be better. For you, for us." Emily's eyes softened as she listened to him. She wasn't sure what the future held, but at least now there was a glimmer of hope. At least now they were both committed to doing the work it would take to rebuild what had been damaged. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but Emily believed that if they were both willing to put in the effort, they could move past this. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "But I need you to understand that this is bigger than just one mistake. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again." David reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand. And I'm ready. Whatever it takes." For the first time in days, Emily felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know if everything would be perfect from here on out, but she knew that they were both willing to learn, to grow, and to make things right. And that was the first step toward healing. As the conversation came to a close, both of them felt a little lighter, a little more hopeful. There was still work to be done, but for the first time since the wedding, they both felt like they were moving in the right direction. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least they were walking it together. Weeks had passed since that tense moment at the wedding. David and Emily were still trying to heal, to move past what had happened. But there was no denying that the events of that day had left a mark. For Emily, the journey to forgiveness hadn't been easy. She wasn't someone who could just brush things off. When something hurt her, it stayed with her until she processed it fully. And this was no small matter. It was about trust, respect, and how they viewed each other. David, too, had been carrying the weight of what happened. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. His pride, which had always been his armor, had been shattered that day. He was used to being the one in control, the one who had all the answers. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was out of his depth. He knew he had made a mistake, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. Apologies could only go so far. There had to be more to it than that. There had to be action, a real change in how he approached people, how he approached life. But what David didn't know was that the more he reflected, the more he realized that the change needed to start not just with him, but with the way he viewed the world. It wasn't enough to say he was sorry and hope everything would go back to normal. He had to prove with time and effort that he could be different, that he could be the man Emily needed him to be, not just for her, but for himself as well. Emily, for her part, was also wrestling with her feelings. She had seen the genuine remorse in David's eyes, and she believed that he was trying to change. But it was hard for her to forget how quickly he had judged someone, how easily he had assumed the worst without thinking. That moment, that accusation, had shaken her confidence in him. And although she was committed to working things out, she knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It would take time, patience, and a lot of honest conversations. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Emily decided to take a walk to clear her mind. She wasn't sure where the path would lead, but she needed some space to think. The weight of everything, the wedding, the confrontation, the silent tension between them had become too much to carry. She didn't want to make decisions in the heat of the moment, and she didn't want to do anything that might make things worse. She just needed time to breathe, time to process. David, on the other hand, had noticed the shift in her. He had sensed that she was pulling away a little more each day. The light-hearted conversations they used to have were now replaced by awkward silences, and the warmth that once filled their interactions was now replaced by cold distance. He knew it wasn't because she didn't love him anymore. It was because the trust they had once shared had been fractured. And though he had apologized and promised to do better, he knew that it was going to take more than words to fix what had been broken. He couldn't stand the idea of Emily feeling alone, of her carrying the burden of what had happened between them. He understood now that she needed more than just his promises. She needed actions, not just words. She needed him to show her every single day that he was committed to being a better partner, someone she could trust again. After a while, Emily returned home, her mind clearer than before. The walk had given her the space she needed to think, and she realized that although she was still hurt, she didn't want to walk away from her relationship with David. She loved him and she believed that he could change, but she needed him to understand the depth of her feelings, to understand that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. She found David sitting on the couch, staring out the window with a look of quiet frustration. He turned when he heard her enter, and his eyes immediately softened. There was a moment of hesitation between them, both unsure of how to proceed, but Emily knew it was time to talk again, to lay everything out in the open once and for all. "David, can we talk?" she asked gently, sitting down next to him. He looked at her, his face filled with concern. "Of course. We need to talk. I've been thinking a lot." Emily began, her voice steady but with an edge of vulnerability. And I realize that I haven't fully processed everything. I'm still hurt, but I don't want to just keep holding on to that hurt. I want us to move forward, but I need to know that you're really willing to do the work to change. I need to know that this isn't just about a few apologies and then hoping things will go back to normal. David nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He could feel the weight of the moment, and he knew that this conversation was crucial. It wasn't just about fixing things quickly, it was about showing her, through his actions, that he was committed to doing better. I know I've messed up, and I know I can't just say sorry and expect everything to be okay, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. I've been thinking a lot, and I realize that I've spent so much time thinking about myself, thinking about my own feelings and my own pride, that I haven't really seen things from your perspective. I haven't truly understood how my actions affected you, and that's on me. I can't change the past, but I can promise you that I'm going to work every day to be better, to earn your trust back. Emily watched him carefully, studying his face, the sincerity in his eyes. She wasn't sure if it would be enough, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like he was finally seeing things clearly. She had spent so many days feeling like she was carrying the weight of their relationship alone. But in this moment, she felt like David was finally meeting her halfway. I want to believe you, she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. But trust isn't something that comes back overnight. It takes time. I need you to understand that. I can't just flip a switch and forget everything that happened. But I'm willing to try if you are. I'm willing to work on this together. David reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it. I'm willing. More than anything. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm ready to put in the work. I don't want to lose you, Emily. I don't want to lose what we have. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she squeezed his hand back. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the perfect solution, and it wouldn't be easy. But it was a start. It was a chance to rebuild, to repair the damage that had been done, and for the first time since that day at the wedding, she felt like there was a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges along the way, but they were both willing to try. And sometimes that's all it took. We'll take it one day at a time, Emily said, her voice soft but full of resolve. But I think we can get through this as long as we're both committed to it. David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief. One day at a time, he repeated. And I'll be here every step of the way. The tension between them hadn't vanished completely, but for the first time in weeks, they both felt like they were on the same page. There was still work to be done, so much work, but now they were ready to face it together. They were ready to rebuild not just their relationship, but their trust in each other. And with that, for the first time since the wedding, they felt like they could breathe again. They didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to find them side by side. As they sat there, their hands still intertwined, the quiet in the room didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the beginning of something new. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a turning point, a chance for them to grow stronger, not despite the difficulties they had faced, but because of them.